Hey guys, tonight we're taking you back to ancient Rome, but not the sanitized Hollywood version with gleaming marble and heroic speeches. You're about to experience the real Roman Empire, a place where your morning routine could literally kill you, your neighbor's waste landed on your head, and surviving to age 35 made you a statistical miracle. Picture yourself as Marcus the average Roman, waking up in 150 CE to face another day in the greatest civilization the world had ever known, which also happened to be one of the most disgusting, dangerous, and deadly places a human being could possibly live. You probably wouldn't survive this. Not because you lack courage or intelligence, but because Roman daily life was an obstacle course of disease, violence, and toxic substances that would challenge a modern Navy SEAL with a medical degree and hazmat training. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little global community of history nerds and insomniacs come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your Roman morning begins before dawn in your cramped apartment, and the first challenge is simply getting out of bed without stepping on the chamber pot that served as your nighttime bathroom. Roman homes didn't have running water or indoor plumbing unless you were wealthy enough to own a villa, which you definitely aren't. The clay pot beside your straw mattress contains the accumulated waste of everyone in your family, and it's your job to carry it downstairs and empty it into the street, assuming you can navigate the dark stairwell without tripping and covering yourself in human excrement. The communal latrine down the street represents Roman engineering at its most practical and most horrifying. You're sitting on a marble bench with holes cut at regular intervals, shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, engaging in what passes for morning conversation while everyone conducts their business simultaneously. There's no privacy, no individual stalls, and definitely no toilet paper as you know it. Instead, there's a communal sponge on a stick called a tersorium that gets rinsed in a trough of running water, or at least water that was running yesterday, and shared among everyone using the facilities. Roman toilet hygiene involved techniques that would make modern germaphobes weep with horror. The tersorium sponge was theoretically cleaned between users, but cleaned in Roman terms meant a quick swish in water that had already been used by dozens of other people for the same purpose. Medical experts estimate that Roman public latrines were essentially disease distribution centers where intestinal parasites, dysentery, and various bacterial infections spread with remarkable efficiency through the shared cleaning implements. Your morning dental routine involves rinsing your mouth with urine, preferably your own, though imported Portuguese urine was considered superior for whitening teeth. Romans believed that ammonia in aged urine cleaned and strengthened teeth, and they weren't entirely wrong about the cleaning part, though the long-term health effects of regularly gargling with waste products were probably less beneficial than Romans imagined. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices for exotic urine varieties, creating a luxury market for bodily waste that says something profound about Roman consumer culture. Roman breakfast, if you could afford it, consisted of bread that was often adulterated with chalk, beans, or other fillers to increase volume and reduce costs. Roman bakers were notorious for their creative ingredient substitutions, and food regulation was essentially non-existent. Your morning meal might include watered-down wine that had been sweetened with lead-based compounds, providing a daily dose of heavy metal poisoning that accumulated over time and contributed to the neurological problems that affected much of the Roman population. The water you drink comes from public fountains supplied by Rome's famous aqueduct system, which was genuinely impressive engineering but delivered water through lead pipes that contaminated the supply with toxic metals. Romans were aware that lead could be dangerous. They knew it caused problems for people who worked with it directly, but they didn't understand that chronic low-level exposure through drinking water was slowly poisoning the entire population. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire, But there's no debate that Romans consumed dangerous levels of toxic metals through their daily routines. Modern analysis of Roman bones shows lead concentrations that would be considered severe poisoning by contemporary medical standards, suggesting that Romans lived their entire lives dealing with neurological impairment that they considered normal. Your morning clothing routine involves wrapping yourself in layers of fabric that require assistance to put on properly and must be arranged in specific ways to avoid social embarrassment or legal problems. Roman clothing laws specified which garments could be worn by which social classes, and appearing in public dressed inappropriately could result in fines, public humiliation, or worse consequences depending on how seriously you'd violated social expectations. Roman mournings also included religious obligations that couldn't be ignored without risking social ostracism or legal consequences. Household gods required daily attention, neighborhood shrines needed appropriate recognition, and various festivals throughout the year demanded participation that could consume entire days. Roman religious life was a complex web of obligations that added layers of stress and time commitment to daily routines that were already challenging enough for people trying to earn enough money to survive. The Romans you encounter on the street are dealing with the same challenges you face, creating a population that's chronically malnourished, lead-poisoned, and struggling with parasitic infections that medieval medicine can't effectively treat. Everyone looks older than their actual age, most people are missing teeth, and the general health baseline is so low that what Romans considered normal would send modern people directly to emergency rooms. You step outside your tenement building and immediately realize that Roman urban planning was designed by people who apparently never considered that millions of humans living in close proximity might produce waste, traffic problems, or the need for basic safety measures. The streets of Rome are an assault on every sense you possess, and navigating them successfully requires skills that combine the reflexes of a combat veteran with the stomach of a medieval plague doctor. The first thing that hits you is the smell. A complex bouquet of human waste, animal excrement, rotting food, unwashed bodies, industrial chemicals, and death that hangs over the city like a permanent fog. Romans emptied their chamber pots directly into the streets from upper-story windows, creating a daily rainfall of human waste that mixed with horse manure, dog droppings, and the occasional human corpse to create a street surface that's part pavement, part sewage, and entirely disgusting. Roman streets weren't paved with the clean stone you see in movies. They were covered with a mixture of mud, waste, and decomposing organic matter that created a walking surface with the consistency of thick soup and the aroma of an open sewer. Your shoes, if you're wealthy enough to own them, will be completely ruined by the end of the day, and the hem of your toga will be permanently stained with substances you don't want to identify. The famous Roman roads that connected the empire were engineering marvels, but the city streets of Rome itself were narrow, crowded, and designed for a population about 1/10 the size of the million people who actually lived there. Traffic jams were constant problems that involved pedestrians, handcarts, donkeys, horses, slaves carrying wealthy Romans in litters, and the occasional elephant being transported for gladiatorial games, all trying to occupy the same inadequate space simultaneously. Roman traffic laws were essentially non-existent, creating a free-for-all where might made right and pedestrians were responsible for their own survival. Wealthy Romans in litters expected everyone else to get out of their way. Merchants with carts claimed right-of-way based on economic necessity, and everyone else scrambled to avoid being trampled by animals or crushed by vehicles that had no braking systems worth mentioning. Street vendors lined every available space, selling food that had been sitting in the sun for unknown periods, wine that had been watered down to increase profits, and manufactured goods that were probably stolen from someone else. Roman street merchants were notorious for their aggressive sales tactics, and walking through commercial districts meant running a gauntlet of people trying to grab your toga, shout in your face, and convince you to buy products you didn't need with money you didn't have. The noise level in Roman streets was overwhelming by modern standards. A constant cacophony of shouting merchants, braying animals, creaking cartwheels, construction work, and the general din of 1 million people trying to conduct their daily business in a space designed for a much smaller population. Romans lived their entire lives surrounded by noise pollution that would violate every modern city ordinance and probably cause permanent hearing damage. Roman construction sites were death traps where workers operated without safety equipment while building structures that regularly collapsed and killed the people living in them. You dodge falling debris, avoid open excavations, and step around construction materials that have been left in the middle of walkways because Roman workplace safety regulations didn't exist and Roman contractors weren't particularly concerned about public convenience. Street crime was a constant threat that ranged from pickpocketing to outright robbery and murder. Roman streets were patrolled by vigiles, firefighters who also served as police, but they were understaffed, poorly equipped, and more focused on preventing fires than stopping crime. Roman citizens were essentially responsible for their own protection, which created a culture where everyone assumed that violence was a normal part of daily life. The garbage situation in Roman streets defied modern comprehension. Romans threw their trash directly onto the streets, creating accumulations of rotting food, broken pottery, discarded clothing, and industrial waste that attracted rats, insects, and scavenging animals. Street cleaners existed in theory, but in practice, Roman streets were cleaned primarily by rain, scavenging animals, and the gradual decomposition of organic waste. Roman streets also served as open-air markets where people sold everything from food to slaves to exotic animals imported from across the empire. These markets operated without health regulations, quality controls, or safety standards, creating shopping experiences that combined commerce with genuine physical danger. Buying food from street vendors was essentially gambling with your life, but many Romans had no other options for obtaining meals. Historians still argue whether Roman urban planning was actually as chaotic as surviving accounts suggest or whether modern people simply have different expectations about city organization, but archaeological evidence supports descriptions of Roman cities as crowded, unsanitary, and dangerous places where survival required constant vigilance and considerable luck. The public fountains that provided water for most Romans were gathering places where people socialized, conducted business, and occasionally fought over access to clean water. These fountains were fed by Rome's impressive aqueduct system, but the water quality varied dramatically depending on the time of day, seasonal conditions, and how many people had been using the fountain for purposes other than drinking. Roman street lighting was non-existent, which meant that sunset transformed the already dangerous streets into genuinely terrifying environments where criminals operated with impunity and honest citizens barricaded themselves in their homes until daylight returned. Night travel in Roman cities was essentially suicide unless you were wealthy enough to hire armed escorts and carry torches that advertised your location to everyone looking for victims to rob. The economic activity that took place on Roman streets created opportunities for people willing to work, but most street-level jobs involved physical labor that was dangerous, poorly paid, and offered no job security or benefits. Street porters carried heavy loads for small payments. Messengers ran through dangerous neighborhoods delivering messages for people who could afford to pay, and countless Romans scraped by through informal economic activities that existed in legal gray areas. You're searching for work in Rome, and if you expected anything resembling job security, workers' rights, or fair compensation, you're about to discover that Roman employment practices made modern sweatshops look like luxury vacation resorts. Welcome to the Roman job market, where most positions were essentially different varieties of slavery. The workplace safety manual consisted of "try not to die," and your employer's primary concern was extracting maximum productivity from workers who were cheaper to replace than to maintain. Roman slavery wasn't just a separate economic system. It was the foundation that made all other Roman employment possible by creating artificial scarcity in the free labor market. With millions of enslaved people performing skilled and unskilled work for nothing but food and shelter, free Romans were competing against workers who literally couldn't quit, couldn't demand better conditions, and couldn't negotiate for higher wages. This created an economic environment where free laborers were barely better off than slaves and had to accept working conditions that were dangerous, degrading, and barely profitable. The construction work that employed thousands of Romans involved building techniques that prioritized speed and cost savings over worker safety. Roman construction sites were death traps where workers used primitive tools, worked without protective equipment, and handled materials that were inherently dangerous. Lime mortar caused chemical burns, heavy stones crushed workers who couldn't get out of the way fast enough, and scaffolding collapsed regularly because Roman engineering prioritized the finished product over the safety of the people building it. Roman manufacturing work exposed employees to toxic substances that caused immediate health problems and long-term poisoning that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life. Lead smelting, mercury mining, and various chemical processes required workers to handle dangerous materials without protection, creating occupational hazards that guaranteed health problems for everyone involved in these industries. Roman workers knew these jobs were dangerous, but economic necessity forced people to accept risks that were essentially guaranteed to cause illness or death. Agricultural work around Rome involved intensive farming techniques that required backbreaking physical labor for small financial returns. Roman farmers worked small plots of exhausted soil using tools that hadn't changed much since the Bronze Age, competing against large slave-operated estates that could produce crops more efficiently and sell them at lower prices. Free Roman farmers were being driven out of business by economic forces they couldn't control, creating rural unemployment that drove people into cities where job prospects were even worse. The service economy that employed many urban Romans consisted of jobs that required workers to deal with wealthy Romans who treated employees like slightly more expensive slaves. Roman servants, shop workers, and craftsmen dealt with customers who expected complete subservience, immediate compliance with unreasonable demands, and perfect service despite working conditions that made excellence nearly impossible to achieve. Roman employers fired workers for minor mistakes, withheld wages for arbitrary reasons, and generally treated employees as disposable resources. Roman retail work involved selling products in markets where competition was cutthroat, profit margins were minimal, and customer violence was a routine occupational hazard. Roman merchants dealt with customers who haggled aggressively, shoplifted regularly, and sometimes settled disputes through physical violence that could escalate into riots. Working in Roman markets required combat skills as much as business knowledge, and many merchants carried weapons as standard business equipment. Transport work in Rome was particularly hazardous because it involved moving heavy loads through crowded streets filled with obstacles, criminals, and traffic that operated without rules or safety considerations. Roman porters developed hernias, back injuries, and joint problems that ended their careers early and left them unable to work. Cart drivers dealt with vehicles that had no safety features, animals that were unpredictable, and roads that were designed for lighter traffic loads than they actually carried. Roman mining work was essentially a death sentence that was carried out slowly through exposure to toxic substances, cave-ins, and working conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation. Roman mines operated without ventilation systems, structural supports, or emergency procedures, creating workplaces where accidents were routine and survival rates were so low that mining assignments were often used as alternative forms of execution for convicted criminals. The fishing industry around Rome involved small boats operated by people who couldn't afford better equipment, fishing in waters that were increasingly polluted by urban waste and industrial runoff. Roman fishermen dealt with unpredictable weather, equipment failures, and markets that paid subsistence wages for dangerous work that required skills developed over lifetimes of experience. Historians still argue whether Roman working conditions were actually worse than those in other ancient societies, or if we simply have better documentation of Roman labor practices. But evidence suggests that Roman workers faced challenges that were unusually severe even by ancient standards. The combination of slave competition, urban overcrowding, and economic inequality created working conditions that were difficult even for people who were accustomed to hardship. Roman workplace accidents were routine occurrences that were treated as normal business expenses rather than preventable tragedies. Workers who were injured on the job received no compensation, medical care, or job protection, leaving them responsible for dealing with injuries that often ended their ability to work and earn money. Roman society had no social safety net for people who couldn't work, creating situations where workplace injuries often led to destitution and death. The apprenticeship system that trained skilled Roman workers involved years of unpaid labor that often didn't lead to permanent employment or economic security. Roman apprentices worked long hours for masters who were primarily interested in extracting free labor rather than providing genuine education, and many apprenticeships were essentially exploitation schemes disguised as training programs. Roman workers formed informal networks and occasionally organized strikes or protests. But these actions were risky because Roman authorities treated labor unrest as threats to public order that required violent suppression. Roman workers who participated in strikes faced imprisonment, physical punishment, or exile, making collective action dangerous for people who were already living on the margins of economic survival. The gig economy that employed many Romans consisted of day labor, temporary assignments, and informal work arrangements that provided no job security or predictable income. Roman workers who depended on temporary employment faced constant uncertainty about their next paycheck and had no way to plan for future expenses or emergencies that required financial resources they might not have. You're getting hungry, and Roman dining options are about to demonstrate why food poisoning was considered a normal part of daily life rather than a preventable disaster. Welcome to Roman fast food, where the mystery meat actually is mysterious, the wine is sweetened with compounds that will slowly kill you, and the health department is a concept that won't be invented for another 18 centuries. Your stomach is rumbling, but your digestive system is about to face challenges that would make a medieval peasant's diet look like fine dining. Roman street food vendors operated without refrigeration, food safety regulations, or any understanding of the bacterial processes that turn food into biological weapons. The meat pies sold from street carts contained ingredients that were difficult to identify even when they were fresh, and freshness was a relative concept in a world where food preservation meant salting, smoking, or hoping that customers would buy products before they became obviously dangerous to consume. The papini, Roman fast food restaurants, served meals that were prepared hours or days in advance and kept warm over fires that filled the food with smoke, ash, and whatever chemicals were produced by burning wood that might have been treated with substances that weren't originally intended for human consumption. Roman cooking fires often burned refuse, construction waste, and materials that produced toxic fumes that flavored the food and probably contributed to the respiratory problems that affected most urban Romans. Roman bread, which formed the foundation of most meals, was often adulterated with substances that increased volume while decreasing nutritional value and safety. Roman bakers mixed chalk, beans, peas, and other fillers into their dough to reduce costs and increase profits, creating bread that looked substantial but provided minimal nutrition and sometimes contained materials that were actively harmful to human digestion. The wine that accompanied most Roman meals was treated with lead-based compounds that improved flavor while slowly poisoning everyone who consumed it regularly. Romans used lead acetate, which they called sugar of lead, to sweeten wine that had gone sour, creating beverages that tasted pleasant but delivered doses of heavy metals that accumulated in the body and caused neurological damage over time. Roman wine was also commonly diluted with water that might have been contaminated with sewage, industrial waste, or other substances that weren't originally intended for human consumption. Roman cheese was produced using aging processes that sometimes involved controlled decomposition that bordered on controlled rotting. Roman cheesemakers didn't understand the bacterial processes that created the flavors they desired, leading to products that were sometimes genuinely toxic rather than merely aged. Roman diners regularly consumed dairy products that would send modern food safety inspectors into panic attacks and probably caused digestive problems that Romans accepted as normal parts of eating. The garum, fermented fish sauce, that Romans used to flavor most of their food was produced through decomposition processes that created intense flavors along with bacterial cultures that could cause serious illness if the fermentation went wrong. Roman garum production involved leaving fish entrails to rot in the sun for months, creating condiments that were either delicious or deadly depending on factors that Roman producers didn't fully understand or control. Roman meat dishes were prepared using animals that had been slaughtered under conditions that didn't include safety inspections, quality controls, or standards that prevented diseased animals from entering the food supply. Roman butchers sold meat from animals that had died from diseases, accidents, or old age, creating protein sources that were affordable but potentially dangerous to consume. The olive oil that Romans used for cooking and food preparation was often rancid because storage and transportation methods didn't prevent oxidation that turned healthy fats into compounds that caused digestive problems and probably contributed to the chronic stomach issues that affected much of the Roman population. Roman olive oil merchants had financial incentives to sell products that were past their prime rather than disposing of oils that were no longer safe for consumption. Roman restaurants operated without health inspections, cleanliness standards, or regulations that prevented food preparation in environments that were contaminated with waste, chemicals, or disease vectors. Roman kitchens were typically located in basements or ground floor spaces that flooded regularly, creating cooking environments where ingredients mixed with sewage, street runoff, and whatever other substances had accumulated in urban drainage systems. The serving implements used in Roman restaurants were cleaned with methods that didn't effectively remove bacteria, food residue, or other contaminants that accumulated between uses. Roman dishwashing involved water that was reused multiple times and cleaning agents that weren't particularly effective at sanitizing surfaces that had been in contact with potentially dangerous foods. Historians still argue whether Romans actually had stronger digestive systems than modern people or simply died frequently from food-related illnesses that they didn't connect to their dining habits, but evidence suggests that Roman food safety practices routinely exposed consumers to health risks that modern people would consider unacceptable. Roman life expectancy was probably reduced by dietary factors that were entirely preventable with better food handling practices. Roman dining customs required people to eat with their hands, share serving dishes, and consume food in ways that promoted the transmission of bacteria and parasites between diners. Roman meals were social events where people spread diseases as efficiently as they shared food, creating dining experiences that were both culturally important and medically dangerous. The exotic foods that wealthy Romans imported from across the empire were often spoiled by the time they reached Rome because preservation methods weren't adequate for long-distance transport of perishable items. Roman luxury dining involved consuming ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles without refrigeration, creating meals that were expensive, prestigious, and potentially lethal. Roman food vendors had financial incentives to sell products that were past their prime rather than absorbing losses from spoiled inventory, creating markets where consumers regularly purchased food that was dangerous to eat. Roman food prices were high enough that people couldn't afford to be choosy about quality, forcing consumers to buy products that they knew might be harmful because the alternatives were starvation or spending money they didn't have. The spices and seasonings that Romans used to flavor their food were often adulterated with cheaper substances that increased volume while reducing quality and safety. Roman spice merchants mixed valuable seasonings with materials that weren't originally intended for human consumption, creating condiments that tasted approximately correct but contained substances that were harmful to human health. You're heading to the Roman public baths, and if you expect anything resembling modern spa relaxation, you're about to discover that Roman bathing was a communal health crisis disguised as a recreational activity. Welcome to the Thermae, where hundreds of Romans shared the same water, diseases spread with remarkable efficiency, and the cleaning supplies could kill you faster than the bacteria they were supposed to eliminate. Roman public baths operated on principles that would make modern epidemiologists weep with horror. Hundreds or thousands of people sharing the same water throughout the day, with minimal filtration, no chemical treatment, and cleaning protocols that relied more on hope than science. The water in Roman baths was changed infrequently, sometimes only once per week, creating bacterial cultures that were essentially petri dishes large enough to swim in. The entrance to the baths reveals Roman social hierarchies in their most naked form, literally. Roman bathing was segregated by social class, with wealthy patrons using separate facilities or bathing at different times than common citizens, but even the upper-class sections operated under sanitary conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Romans of all classes shared water that had been contaminated by previous bathers, creating democratic disease transmission that crossed economic boundaries. Roman bath attendants provided services that ranged from helpful to hazardous, including massage with oils that were reused between customers, hair removal using techniques that frequently caused infections, and skin treatments with substances that were supposed to improve appearance but often caused chemical burns or allergic reactions. Roman beauty treatments were essentially medical experiments performed by people who lacked training in either medicine or cosmetology. The strigil, a curved metal scraper used to remove dirt and dead skin, was shared between bathers or reused without proper cleaning, creating implements that were essentially bacteria transfer devices designed to spread infections between users. Roman bathers scraped their skin with metal tools that had been used by dozens of previous customers, creating opportunities for disease transmission that were both intimate and efficient. Roman bath water temperatures were maintained at levels that promoted bacterial growth while inhibiting the natural immune responses that might have protected bathers from infection. The warm, moist environment of Roman baths created perfect conditions for the cultivation and transmission of skin infections, respiratory illnesses, and various bacterial diseases that spread through water contact or airborne transmission. The Roman bathroom facilities attached to public baths featured the same communal toilets you encountered earlier, but now you're using them while naked and wet, which somehow makes the experience even more unpleasant and probably more dangerous from a disease transmission perspective. Roman bathroom arrangements combined the worst aspects of public sanitation with the additional challenges of maintaining hygiene while participating in group bathing activities. Roman baths also served as informal medical clinics where people with various ailments came to seek relief through hot water treatments, creating environments where sick people mixed with healthy people in confined spaces with optimal conditions for disease transmission. Romans believed that bathing could cure various illnesses, leading to situations where contagious patients shared facilities with people who weren't yet sick but soon would be. The oils and perfumes used in Roman baths were often rancid or contaminated with substances that caused skin irritation, allergic reactions, or chemical burns that created open wounds vulnerable to infection. Roman bath oils were expensive enough that they were diluted with cheaper substances that weren't necessarily safe for human skin contact, creating cosmetic treatments that were sometimes more dangerous than therapeutic. Roman bath architecture included features like hypocausts, underground heating systems that created warm, humid environments perfect for bacterial growth while providing minimal ventilation that might have reduced disease transmission. Roman engineering expertise created buildings that were comfortable for human use and ideal for pathogen cultivation, combining the worst aspects of poor air circulation with optimal temperature and humidity for microbial reproduction. The social aspects of Roman bathing included conversations, business dealings, and various activities that required close personal contact between people who were naked, wet, and sharing contaminated water. Roman baths were networking venues where people formed professional relationships while exposing themselves to diseases that could end their careers or lives, creating social experiences that combined opportunity with genuine physical danger. Roman bath etiquette required behaviors that promoted disease transmission, including sharing implements, touching common surfaces, and participating in activities that involved close physical contact with multiple people throughout the bathing process. Roman social customs essentially guaranteed that anyone who used public baths would be exposed to whatever diseases were currently circulating among the bathing population. Historians still argue whether Roman public baths actually improved public health through improved hygiene or worsened it through disease transmission, but modern epidemiological analysis suggests that Roman bathing practices created ideal conditions for spreading bacterial infections, parasites, and various communicable diseases throughout urban populations. The exercise areas attached to Roman baths provided opportunities for physical fitness activities that were performed by naked people sharing equipment that wasn't cleaned between users. Roman exercise routines involved wrestling, weightlifting, and various athletic activities that created opportunities for disease transmission through skin contact, shared surfaces, and respiratory droplets produced during physical exertion. Roman bath complexes included food and drink services that operated under the same sanitary conditions as street vendors, but now customers were consuming potentially dangerous food while naked, wet, and physiologically stressed by temperature changes and physical exertion that might have reduced their immune system effectiveness. The clothing storage areas in Roman baths were communal spaces where personal belongings were mixed together, creating opportunities for the transmission of parasites, skin diseases, and various pathogens that could survive on fabric or leather goods. Romans retrieved their clothing from storage areas where their personal items had been in contact with garments worn by people with various infectious diseases. Roman bathing represented the peak of ancient world hygiene technology, while simultaneously creating health risks that were probably worse than the problems that bathing was supposed to solve. Romans developed sophisticated engineering solutions for heating and distributing water, while completely ignoring the bacterial contamination that made their bathing facilities dangerous to use. You're climbing the narrow, rickety stairs to your Roman apartment, and with each creaking step upward, you're discovering that Roman housing was essentially a vertical death trap designed by people who apparently believed that structural integrity was optional and fire safety was for cowards. Welcome to your insulae. Roman tenement buildings that combined the worst aspects of overcrowding, poor construction, and complete disregard for human safety into residential experiences that made medieval dungeons look like luxury accommodations. Roman apartment buildings were constructed using techniques that prioritized speed and cost savings over structural stability, creating multi-story buildings that regularly collapsed without warning and killed everyone inside. Roman builders used cheap materials, minimal foundations, and construction methods that produced buildings which were essentially temporary structures that happened to last long enough for people to move in before they fell down. Archaeological evidence suggests that building collapses were routine occurrences that Romans accepted as normal urban hazards. Your apartment on the 4th floor requires climbing stairs that weren't designed to support the weight of people carrying water, food, furniture, or other necessities up multiple flights of steps that were constructed without railings, adequate lighting, or structural reinforcement. Roman stairwells were accident zones where people regularly fell to their deaths while attempting to navigate poorly constructed access routes that became increasingly dangerous as buildings aged and structural supports weakened. The walls of your Roman apartment are thin enough that you can hear every conversation, argument, and bodily function of your neighbors, creating living conditions where privacy was impossible and noise pollution was constant. Roman apartment walls were constructed using minimal materials that provided little sound insulation, creating residential environments where hundreds of people lived in acoustic intimacy that would drive modern people to homicidal rage. Roman apartments lacked running water, which meant that residents had to carry all their water up multiple flights of stairs from street-level fountains, creating daily physical challenges that were exhausting and dangerous. Romans living in upper-story apartments faced the choice between dehydration and the back-breaking labor of hauling water upstairs that weren't designed to support people carrying heavy loads, creating situations where basic hydration required significant physical effort and risk. Your Roman apartment heating consisted of whatever heat you could generate from small braziers that filled your living space with smoke, carbon monoxide, and fire hazards that regularly ignited the wooden construction materials that surrounded them. Roman heating systems were essentially controlled fires that were maintained in buildings constructed from flammable materials, creating residential environments where warmth and death were separated by very small margins of error in fire management. The lighting in your Roman apartment came from oil lamps that produced minimal illumination while creating additional fire hazards and air pollution that contributed to the respiratory problems that affected most urban Romans. Roman lighting technology provided just enough visibility to accomplish basic tasks while generating smoke and toxic fumes that were harmful to human health and dangerous to building safety. Roman apartment construction used wood that was often green, poorly seasoned, or salvaged from other structures, creating building materials that warped, cracked, and deteriorated rapidly under the stresses of supporting multi-story residential buildings. Roman builders used whatever timber was cheapest and most available, regardless of its suitability for construction purposes, creating structures that were fundamentally unstable from the moment they were completed. The waste disposal systems in Roman apartments consisted of throwing garbage and human waste out of windows onto the streets below, creating sanitation problems that affected entire neighborhoods and contributed to the disease transmission that made urban Roman life dangerous. Roman apartments had no plumbing or waste management infrastructure, forcing residents to dispose of their waste in ways that contaminated their immediate environment and posed health risks to everyone in the area. Roman apartment fires were catastrophic events that typically destroyed entire buildings and killed most of the residents because Roman construction methods created structures that burned quickly and completely while providing minimal escape routes for people trapped inside. Roman firefighting technology was primitive and ineffective, meaning that apartment fires usually burned until they ran out of fuel rather than being extinguished by organized firefighting efforts. The overcrowding in Roman apartments created living conditions where entire families shared single rooms with strangers, creating social tensions and health risks that were exacerbated by the stress of urban poverty and the physical challenges of apartment living. Roman apartment residents lived in closer proximity to more people than most humans had ever experienced, creating psychological and social pressures that contributed to the violence and social dysfunction that characterized Roman urban life. Roman apartment rents consumed most of residents' income, creating economic pressures that forced people to accept living conditions that were dangerous and unhealthy because the alternatives were homelessness or leaving the city where economic opportunities were concentrated. Roman landlords charged high rents for apartments that were barely habitable, creating housing markets where demand far exceeded supply and tenants had no leverage to demand better conditions. Historians still argue whether Roman apartment living was actually worse than rural alternatives or simply different types of hardship, but evidence suggests that Roman urban housing created health and safety risks that were unusually severe even by ancient standards. The combination of overcrowding, poor construction, and minimal regulation created residential environments that were dangerous for everyone involved. The legal protections available to Roman apartment residents were minimal and rarely enforced, leaving tenants vulnerable to exploitation by landlords who had few incentives to maintain their properties or provide safe living conditions. Roman housing law favored property owners over tenants, creating rental markets where dangerous conditions were economically rational for landlords and legally difficult for tenants to challenge. Roman apartment construction methods created buildings that were vulnerable to earthquakes, floods, storms, and other natural disasters that regularly destroyed residential areas and killed large numbers of people who had no alternatives to living in structurally unsafe buildings. Roman urban planning didn't include disaster preparedness or building codes that might have reduced the vulnerability of residential construction to natural hazards. The social dynamics of Roman apartment living created communities where neighbors were simultaneously intimate and hostile, sharing living spaces while competing for limited resources and privacy. Roman apartment residents developed social survival skills that balanced cooperation with distrust, creating residential communities that were both supportive and dangerous depending on circumstances that could change rapidly and unpredictably. You're feeling unwell, which in Roman times could mean anything from a minor headache to impending death, so you're visiting a Roman doctor, and you're about to discover that Roman medicine combined genuine medical knowledge with treatments that were more likely to kill you than whatever disease brought you to seek help in the first place. Welcome to Roman healthcare, where the cure was often worse than the disease. Medical theories were based on concepts that had only coincidental relationships with human anatomy, and your doctor's primary qualification was confidence rather than competence. Roman medical education was based on Greek theories that were sophisticated for their time but fundamentally incorrect about basic human physiology, creating doctors who were highly trained in methods that didn't work and confident in treatments that were often harmful. Roman physicians learned elaborate theoretical frameworks that explained disease in terms of humoral imbalances, cosmic influences, and supernatural causes that had no connection to the bacterial and viral infections that actually caused most Roman illnesses. Your Roman doctor begins his examination by checking your pulse, examining your urine, and making observations about your complexion and behavior that he interprets according to medical theories that were creative, internally consistent, and almost entirely wrong. Roman diagnostic methods were based on careful observation of symptoms that were then explained using theoretical frameworks that led to treatments which were frequently more dangerous than the original problems. Roman surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, antiseptic techniques, or understanding of infection control, creating medical interventions that were essentially controlled torture, followed by bacterial contamination of open wounds. Roman surgeons developed impressive technical skills for cutting, stitching, and manipulating human tissues, but they performed these procedures under conditions that made post-surgical infection almost inevitable and often fatal. The Roman pharmacopoeia included drugs that were genuinely effective alongside medications that were useless or actively harmful, creating treatment protocols where patients might receive beneficial treatments mixed with substances that counteracted any positive effects. Roman medicine included opium for pain relief and various plant-based compounds that had genuine therapeutic properties, but these effective treatments were typically combined with dangerous substances that caused additional health problems. Roman doctors prescribed gladiator blood as a treatment for epilepsy, believing that the strength and courage of successful fighters could be transferred to patients through consumption of their bodily fluids. Roman medical theory included concepts about the transferability of personal qualities through ingestion of substances associated with people who possessed desired characteristics, leading to treatments that were based on sympathetic magic rather than medical science. Your Roman physician recommends bloodletting to restore the balance of humors that he believes is causing your illness, using techniques that involved opening veins and allowing significant amounts of blood to drain from your body. Roman bloodletting was performed using instruments that weren't sterilized between patients, creating opportunities for disease transmission while weakening patients who were already struggling with illness. Roman dental care consisted of procedures that were performed without pain relief using tools that were essentially torture devices designed to extract teeth that might have been saved with better techniques. Roman dentists pulled infected teeth, drilled cavities using manual tools, and performed oral surgery under conditions that created additional infections and complications that were often worse than the original dental problems. The Roman theory of disease causation included miasma, bad air, that was thought to carry illness from contaminated environments to healthy people, leading to treatments that focused on air purification rather than addressing the actual bacterial and viral causes of infectious diseases. Roman medicine included some accurate observations about disease transmission, but these insights were embedded in theoretical frameworks that led to ineffective prevention and treatment strategies. Roman hospitals were institutions that combined medical care with religious observances, creating healthcare environments where spiritual interventions were considered as important as physical treatments. Roman medical facilities were typically associated with temples dedicated to healing gods, creating healthcare systems where prayer and sacrifice were standard components of treatment protocols that might or might not include effective medical interventions. Roman medical instruments were sophisticated tools that demonstrated impressive metallurgical and engineering skills, but they were used for procedures that were based on incorrect understanding of human anatomy and physiology. Roman surgical tools were sharp, durable, and well-designed for cutting human tissue, but they were employed for operations that often caused more harm than benefit because Roman medical theory didn't accurately explain how human bodies functioned. The Roman understanding of mental illness was based on theories that attributed psychological problems to supernatural causes, humoral imbalances, or moral failings that required treatments involving physical punishment, dietary restrictions, or spiritual interventions. Roman psychiatry included some accurate observations about the connection between physical and mental health, but these insights were applied using treatment methods that were often harmful to patients who needed supportive care rather than additional trauma. Historians still argue whether Roman medicine actually improved health outcomes or simply provided psychological comfort to patients who were going to recover or die regardless of medical intervention, but evidence suggests that Roman medical treatments were often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to cure. Roman medicine represented the best medical knowledge available in the ancient world, while simultaneously demonstrating how incorrect theoretical frameworks could transform genuine healing intentions into harmful practices. Roman medical training included apprenticeships where students learned surgical techniques by practicing on slaves, prisoners, and other people who couldn't refuse to participate in medical education that involved experimental procedures with unpredictable outcomes. Roman medical schools used human subjects who had no legal protections or ability to consent to procedures that were performed primarily for educational rather than therapeutic purposes. The cost of Roman medical care was high enough that most people couldn't afford professional treatment, creating healthcare systems where effective medical intervention was available primarily to wealthy patients while common Romans relied on folk remedies, religious healing, or simply endured illness without professional medical assistance. Roman healthcare was essentially luxury service that was available to people who could afford to pay for treatments that might or might not be helpful. Roman public health measures included some effective interventions like aqueduct systems and public baths, but these infrastructure improvements were accompanied by medical theories and treatment practices that often negated the health benefits of improved sanitation and water supply. Roman civilization achieved impressive public health improvements through engineering while simultaneously maintaining medical practices that were harmful to individual patients who sought professional health care. You're attending the gladiator games at the Colosseum, and if you expected to be a passive spectator watching choreographed entertainment, you're about to discover that Roman public spectacles were participatory bloodbaths where the audience was expected to make life and death decisions while munching on snacks and socializing with neighbors. Welcome to Roman entertainment, where violence was the main attraction, audience participation was mandatory, and your thumb gesture could determine whether a human being lived or died. The Colosseum seats 50,000 Romans who've come to watch people kill each other for sport, and the crowd dynamics are more terrifying than anything happening in the arena below. Roman audiences didn't just watch gladiatorial combat. They participated in it by voting on the fates of defeated fighters, creating entertainment experiences where spectators became complicit in murder while treating human death as recreational activity that was appropriate for family outings. Roman gladiator training was a brutal process that transformed slaves, criminals, and desperate volunteers into skilled fighters who were taught to kill efficiently while providing maximum entertainment value for audiences who demanded both technical competence and dramatic spectacle. Gladiators learned combat techniques that were designed to produce exciting fights rather than quick deaths, creating entertainment that prolonged human suffering for audience enjoyment. The gladiatorial games served multiple social functions beyond entertainment, including public demonstrations of Roman power, opportunities for political leaders to display their wealth and generosity, and community bonding experiences that reinforced social hierarchies while providing outlets for the violence and aggression that characterized Roman culture. Roman games were essentially propaganda events disguised as entertainment, creating shared experiences that promoted loyalty to the empire while normalizing violence as acceptable social behavior. Roman audiences brought food, drinks, and families to events where human beings were torn apart by wild animals, creating social situations where parents explained the mechanics of violent death to their children while consuming meals and conducting casual conversations. Roman spectators treated gladiatorial combat as background entertainment for social gatherings, creating cultural environments where human suffering was so normalized that it became boring unless it involved particularly creative forms of violence. The exotic animals imported for Roman games were captured from across the empire and transported to Rome under conditions that were so brutal that many animals died during transit, while survivors arrived in psychological states that made them particularly dangerous and unpredictable during arena performances. Roman animal shows featured creatures that were traumatized, starved, and tormented specifically to make them more violent for audience entertainment. Roman crowd control at gladiatorial games involved managing 50,000 people who were consuming alcohol, gambling on fight outcomes, and participating in mob psychology that could turn violent if spectators became dissatisfied with the entertainment being provided. Roman games occasionally resulted in riots that killed more people than the scheduled arena events, creating entertainment venues that were dangerous for spectators as well as participants. The thumbs-up or thumbs-down voting system that determined gladiator survival was a democratic process that involved thousands of people making collective decisions about human life and death based on entertainment value rather than justice, mercy, or any other moral consideration. Roman audiences routinely condemned skilled fighters to death because they hadn't provided sufficiently exciting performances, creating execution systems that were based on crowd entertainment preferences. Roman gladiatorial combat included elaborate staging, costumes, and theatrical elements that transformed human death into dramatic performances with storylines, character development, and audience engagement techniques that made murder into entertainment that was more sophisticated and psychologically engaging than simple violence. Roman games were essentially snuff theater that combined genuine killing with dramatic production values. The betting that accompanied gladiatorial games created financial incentives for spectators to demand specific outcomes that might conflict with mercy, fairness, or the survival interests of the fighters involved. Roman audiences had economic stakes in gladiator deaths that influenced their voting behavior and created entertainment systems where human life was literally traded as a commodity for gambling purposes. Roman games also featured public executions disguised as mythological reenactments, where condemned criminals were forced to play roles in stories that required their actual deaths during performances. Roman creativity in execution methods transformed judicial killings into entertainment spectacles that were marketed as educational and culturally enriching experiences for Roman families. The social pressure to attend gladiatorial games meant that Romans who were disturbed by the violence were forced to participate in entertainment that they found morally objectionable or face social ostracism that could damage their careers and relationships. Roman society created cultural obligations that required people to support entertainment systems that many individuals found personally disturbing. Historians still argue whether Roman audiences actually enjoyed gladiatorial violence or simply participated in cultural activities that were socially mandatory, but evidence suggests that Roman games were genuinely popular entertainment that drew enthusiastic crowds who actively participated in the violence rather than merely tolerating it as social obligation. Roman gladiatorial schools were businesses that trained fighters for entertainment purposes while maintaining them in conditions that were designed to produce skilled combatants rather than healthy human beings. Gladiator trainers had financial incentives to develop fighters who could provide entertaining deaths rather than long, successful careers, creating training programs that prioritized audience satisfaction over fighter welfare. The medical care provided to gladiators was sophisticated by Roman standards but focused on maintaining fighters' ability to perform rather than their long-term health and well-being. Roman gladiator medicine was designed to keep fighters functional for arena performances rather than promoting genuine healing or recovery from the physical and psychological trauma of regular combat. Roman games included halftime entertainment that featured criminal executions, animal hunts, and various spectacles that were designed to maintain audience interest between the main gladiatorial events. Roman entertainment programming created continuous violence that lasted for entire days, providing audiences with sustained exposure to human and animal suffering that was presented as normal recreational activity. The economic system that supported gladiatorial games involved massive expenditures on facilities, fighters, animals, and production costs that were justified by the political and social benefits that rulers derived from providing popular entertainment. Roman games were essentially expensive propaganda programs that used human death as the primary attraction for audiences whose political support was purchased through entertainment rather than effective governance. You're getting dressed for a formal Roman occasion, and if you expected clothing to be a simple matter of covering your body for warmth and modesty, you're about to discover that Roman fashion was an elaborate torture system disguised as social etiquette, where your garments could bankrupt you, required a team of servants to put on properly, and were made from materials that were actively harmful to human health. Welcome to Roman haute couture, where looking respectable meant accepting physical discomfort, financial ruin, and chemical poisoning as normal parts of getting dressed. The Roman toga, that flowing garment that looks so elegant in movies, was actually an 18-foot semicircle of wool that weighed between 15 and 20 pounds when properly arranged and required at least one assistant to drape correctly. Roman togas weren't clothing in the modern sense. They were elaborate textile sculptures that had to be reconstructed every time you put them on, using folding and draping techniques that took hours to master and were impossible to manage alone. Roman toga etiquette required that you wear this massive woolen burden in specific ways that indicated your social status, profession, and political affiliations, creating clothing systems where slight variations in draping could communicate complex social information while making basic physical activities like walking, sitting, or eating into carefully choreographed performances. Romans who wore togas incorrectly faced social embarrassment that could damage their careers and relationships. The purple dye that colored high-status Roman garments was produced from murex shells using processes that required thousands of shellfish to produce small amounts of colorant, making purple clothing so expensive that wearing it was essentially displaying your wealth in the most inefficient way possible. Roman purple dye was more valuable than gold by weight, creating fashion systems where clothing costs could exceed the price of houses. Roman women's makeup included lead-based foundations that provided pale complexions while slowly poisoning the users with heavy metals that caused neurological damage, organ failure, and various health problems that accumulated over years of regular use. Roman beauty standards required cosmetic treatments that were genuinely toxic, creating fashion choices where looking attractive meant accepting serious health risks. The antimony-based eye makeup that Roman women used to darken their eyelashes and eyebrows contained compounds that caused eye infections, vision problems, and other health issues while providing the dramatic appearance that Roman beauty standards demanded. Roman cosmetics were essentially controlled poisoning programs disguised as beauty treatments, creating fashion systems where attractiveness and health were mutually exclusive goals. Roman jewelry was made from materials that included lead, mercury, and other toxic substances that were absorbed through skin contact, creating accessories that were beautiful and dangerous to wear. Roman metalworking techniques produced jewelry that looked impressive while exposing wearers to heavy metal poisoning through prolonged skin contact with contaminated materials. The Roman fashion industry relied on slave labor for textile production, creating clothing systems where the elegance of upper-class garments was produced through human exploitation that made fashion consumption into participation in slavery. Roman clothing was beautiful because it was made by people who had no choice but to produce luxury goods for consumers who could afford to own other human beings. Roman leather goods were produced using tanning processes that involved toxic chemicals, animal waste, and various substances that made leather production one of the most dangerous occupations in the Roman world, while producing materials that retained chemical residues harmful to the people who wore them. Roman leather workers had some of the shortest lifespans of any Roman profession because their work exposed them to substances that caused immediate health problems and long-term poisoning. The silk that wealthy Romans imported from China was transported along trade routes that were so dangerous and expensive that silk clothing represented enormous financial investments in materials that were delicate, difficult to maintain, and impractical for most Roman activities. Roman silk garments were essentially wearable wealth that demonstrated economic status while providing minimal practical benefit for the enormous costs involved. Roman footwear was designed more for appearance than function, creating shoes that were uncomfortable, impractical, and often harmful to foot health. Roman sandals and boots were made using techniques that prioritized style over comfort, creating footwear that caused blisters, deformities, and various foot problems while providing minimal protection from the hazards of Roman street surfaces. The Roman clothing industry operated without quality controls, safety standards, or consumer protections, creating fashion markets where expensive garments were often defective, dangerous, or made from materials that weren't suitable for human wear. Roman consumers paid high prices for clothing that might fall apart, cause health problems, or simply fail to provide the social benefits that justified their enormous costs. Roman fashion trends changed rapidly and unpredictably, creating social pressures to constantly update wardrobes while discarding expensive garments that were no longer socially acceptable. Roman fashion systems created artificial obsolescence that forced people to continuously spend money on clothing updates that were necessary for maintaining social status rather than replacing worn-out garments. Historians still argue whether Roman fashion was primarily about social signaling or genuine aesthetic appreciation, but evidence suggests that Roman clothing systems were more about displaying wealth and status than about practical considerations like comfort, durability, or health safety. Roman fashion was essentially competitive consumption disguised as personal expression. The Roman laundry industry used techniques that were harmful to both clothing and the people who cleaned garments, including the use of urine as a cleaning agent and various chemicals that damaged fabrics while exposing workers to toxic substances. Roman clothing cleaning involved processes that shortened the lifespan of expensive garments while creating occupational hazards for the people who maintained them. Roman clothing storage and maintenance required specialized knowledge, expensive materials, and constant attention to prevent damage from insects, mold, and deterioration that could destroy valuable garments. Roman clothing was investment that required ongoing maintenance costs that sometimes exceeded the original purchase prices, while providing no guarantee that expensive garments wouldn't be destroyed by factors beyond the owner's control. The Roman fashion industry created employment for thousands of people who worked under dangerous conditions for minimal compensation while producing luxury goods that were affordable only to people wealthy enough to own slaves who could maintain and care for expensive clothing. Roman fashion was essentially a pyramid scheme where the majority of participants worked for subsistence wages to produce luxury goods for the small minority who could afford to purchase them. You're facing Roman legal proceedings, and if you expected anything resembling modern concepts of justice, due process, or equal treatment under law, you're about to discover that Roman courts operated on principles that would make medieval witch trials look like models of procedural fairness. Welcome to Roman justice, where your social class determined your punishment before your trial began, torture was standard investigative procedure, and legal representation was available primarily to people who could afford to bribe their way to favorable outcomes. Roman legal proceedings were fundamentally different experiences depending on whether you were a citizen, a slave, or something in between, creating justice systems where identical crimes received vastly different punishments based on the social status of the accused rather than the severity of their actions. Roman law explicitly recognized different categories of people who were subject to different legal procedures and punishments, making legal equality impossible even in theory. If you're a Roman slave accused of a crime, your legal experience will involve torture as a standard part of the investigation process, because Roman legal theory held that slaves couldn't be trusted to tell the truth without physical coercion. Roman courts routinely tortured enslaved witnesses and defendants to extract testimony, creating legal systems where the quality of evidence was determined by the victim's ability to endure pain rather than the accuracy of their statements. Roman citizen defendants faced different procedures that theoretically provided more protections, but these safeguards were often meaningless for people who lacked the wealth and connections necessary to navigate complex legal systems that favored the rich and powerful. Roman citizenship provided legal rights that were valuable in theory but difficult to exercise effectively without resources that most Romans didn't possess. The Roman legal system included punishments that were specifically designed to be more severe for lower-class defendants, creating sentencing guidelines where wealthy criminals received fines while poor criminals faced physical punishment, exile, or death for identical offenses. Roman law codified inequality by establishing different punishment categories for different social classes, making discriminatory sentencing legally required rather than merely tolerated. Roman courts operated without public defenders, legal aid, or other support systems for defendants who couldn't afford professional representation, creating adversarial legal proceedings where wealthy defendants had significant advantages over poor ones. Roman justice was essentially a luxury service that provided better outcomes for people who could pay for superior representation while offering minimal protections for defendants who couldn't afford competent legal assistance. The Roman legal procedure for serious crimes included preliminary investigations that involved torture, intimidation, and various coercive techniques designed to extract confessions rather than determine factual guilt or innocence. Roman investigators assumed that accused criminals were probably guilty and used interrogation methods that were designed to produce admissions rather than discover truth through careful examination of evidence. Roman courtroom proceedings were public spectacles that provided entertainment for audiences who attended trials like theatrical performances, creating legal environments where judges and lawyers played to crowds whose reactions influenced legal outcomes. Roman trials were essentially judicial theater where dramatic presentations often mattered more than factual evidence or legal reasoning. The Roman jury system, when it existed, consisted of people who were selected based on their social status and political connections rather than their ability to evaluate evidence objectively, creating decision-making bodies that were biased toward protecting the interests of the ruling class. Roman juries were typically composed of wealthy citizens who shared social and economic interests with prosecutors and judges rather than representing diverse community perspectives. Roman legal appeals were available primarily to people who could afford the time and money required to pursue additional legal proceedings, creating justice systems where wrong convictions could be corrected only by defendants who possessed resources that most Romans lacked. Roman appeals processes were expensive, time-consuming, and often ineffective, making legal corrections available mainly to wealthy defendants who could survive prolonged legal battles. The Roman legal profession attracted people who were more interested in political advancement and financial gain than in promoting justice or protecting defendants' rights, creating adversarial legal systems where lawyers were primarily concerned with their own career advancement rather than their clients' welfare. Roman legal representation was essentially a business service that prioritized profitable outcomes over ethical considerations or legal principles. Roman legal punishments included creative forms of execution and physical punishment that were designed to provide public entertainment while deterring crime through fear rather than promoting rehabilitation or addressing underlying social problems. Roman criminal justice was essentially state-sponsored terrorism disguised as legal procedure, using spectacular violence to maintain social order through intimidation. The Roman legal system included provisions for wealthy defendants to avoid punishment through financial payments, political influence, or various forms of corruption that were tolerated as normal parts of legal proceedings. Roman justice was available for purchase by people who possessed the resources necessary to influence judges, prosecutors, and other legal officials through bribes, favors, or political pressure. Roman legal procedures for debt collection included slavery as a standard remedy for unpaid obligations, creating civil legal systems where financial problems could result in permanent loss of freedom for debtors and their families. Roman debt law essentially allowed creditors to enslave people who couldn't pay their bills, making economic hardship into a pathway to permanent legal bondage. Historians still argue whether Roman legal systems actually provided more justice than alternative ancient legal traditions or simply created more sophisticated methods for maintaining social inequality through legal mechanisms. But evidence suggests that Roman law was primarily designed to protect the interests of the wealthy and powerful rather than providing equal justice for all Roman subjects. The Roman legal concept of patria potestas gave male heads of households absolute legal authority over their wives, children, and slaves, creating family legal systems where domestic violence, economic exploitation, and various forms of abuse were legally protected activities that couldn't be challenged through legal proceedings. Roman family law essentially legalized tyranny within households while providing no legal recourse for victims of domestic abuse. Roman legal training was available primarily to wealthy young men who could afford years of education that prepared them for careers in law and politics, creating legal professions that were dominated by people from privileged backgrounds who shared economic and social interests with the ruling class they served. Roman legal education produced lawyers and judges who were trained to protect existing social hierarchies rather than challenge systemic inequality through legal reform. You're navigating the bewildering maze of Roman religious life, and if you expected spiritual clarity or organized worship systems, you're about to discover that Roman religion was a chaotic marketplace of competing cults, mandatory rituals, and divine offerings that could bankrupt you while providing no guarantee that the gods wouldn't kill you anyway for reasons that had nothing to do with your piety or moral behavior. Welcome to Roman spirituality, where dozens of deities demanded contradictory sacrifices, emperor worship was legally required, and religious festivals could turn into deadly riots without warning. Roman religious practice required daily attention to household gods, neighborhood deities, professional patron divinities, and various specialized spirits who controlled specific aspects of life that could affect your survival and prosperity. Roman religion wasn't a once-weekly obligation. It was a constant series of ritual requirements that consumed time, money, and mental energy while providing no clear guidance about which gods were actually important enough to deserve your limited resources. The Roman pantheon included hundreds of deities imported from conquered territories, creating religious systems where Jupiter coexisted with Isis, Mithras competed with Christ, and local spirits demanded recognition alongside official state gods. Roman religious tolerance meant that you were expected to honor multiple incompatible belief systems simultaneously, creating spiritual obligations that were logically contradictory and practically impossible to fulfill completely. Roman emperor worship was mandatory civic duty that required participating in religious ceremonies honoring living rulers as divine beings, creating political obligations disguised as spiritual practices. Roman citizens who refused to perform emperor worship faced criminal prosecution for treason, making religious belief into political loyalty tests that could result in execution for people whose spiritual convictions conflicted with state-mandated religious activities. The Roman priesthood included positions that were essentially political offices held by wealthy citizens who purchased religious authority rather than earning it through spiritual qualifications or theological training. Roman priests were often more interested in the social prestige and political advantages of religious office than in providing genuine spiritual guidance or maintaining authentic religious traditions. Roman religious festivals were elaborate public celebrations that could last for days and involved massive expenditures on sacrifices, entertainment, and feasting that were funded through taxation and voluntary contributions that weren't actually voluntary for people who wanted to maintain their social standing. Roman religious celebrations were essentially mandatory community expenses disguised as voluntary spiritual activities. The Roman practice of divination involved consulting various types of professional fortune tellers, oracle interpreters, and supernatural specialists who provided predictions and guidance that were expensive, unreliable, and often contradictory. Roman divination was a thriving industry that exploited people's anxieties about the future while providing no genuine predictive ability or practical guidance for decision-making. Roman sacrifice rituals required killing animals, burning expensive offerings, and destroying valuable goods to appease gods who might or might not appreciate the gifts they received. Roman sacrifice was essentially institutionalized waste that consumed resources that could have been used for practical purposes while providing no measurable benefits beyond psychological comfort for people who believed they were influencing supernatural forces. The Roman mystery cults offered spiritual experiences that were exclusive, expensive, and often dangerous, involving secret rituals that could include mind-altering substances, physical ordeals, and psychological techniques that weren't necessarily safe for participants. Roman mystery religions attracted people seeking authentic spiritual experiences while exposing them to practices that could cause genuine physical and mental harm. Roman religious law included extensive regulations about proper ritual procedures, acceptable sacrifice offerings, and required ceremonial behaviors that had to be performed exactly correctly, or the entire ritual was considered invalid and potentially offensive to the gods involved. Roman religious practice was essentially spiritual perfectionism that demanded flawless execution of complex procedures while providing no forgiveness for human error. The Roman calendar included so many religious festivals and mandatory observances that ordinary economic activities were regularly interrupted by spiritual obligations that prevented people from working, traveling, or conducting business during significant portions of the year. Roman religious scheduling created economic inefficiencies that reduced productivity while imposing additional costs on people who couldn't afford to lose income to mandatory religious participation. Roman religious architecture required massive community investments in temples, altars, and ceremonial facilities that consumed resources that could have been used for infrastructure improvements that would have provided practical benefits to the population. Roman religious construction was essentially competitive monument building that demonstrated community piety while diverting resources from projects that might have improved public health or economic development. The Roman approach to religious pluralism created situations where different cult practices conflicted with each other, leading to religious disputes that could escalate into violence between groups of worshippers who believed their spiritual practices were more authentic or effective than competing religious traditions. Roman religious tolerance often produced religious conflicts rather than promoting peaceful coexistence between different spiritual communities. Roman religious syncretism created hybrid spiritual systems that combined elements from different traditions in ways that were theologically incoherent, but politically convenient for imperial administration of diverse populations with incompatible religious beliefs. Roman religious fusion produced spiritual systems that satisfied no one completely while requiring everyone to participate in religious activities that violated their authentic spiritual convictions. Historians still argue whether Roman religious diversity actually provided spiritual freedom or simply created religious confusion that prevented people from developing coherent spiritual beliefs and practices. But evidence suggests that Roman religious complexity often produced anxiety and uncertainty rather than providing genuine spiritual guidance or community support. The Roman religious emphasis on ritual correctness rather than moral behavior created spiritual systems where people could achieve religious compliance while engaging in activities that were ethically questionable or socially harmful. Roman religion was primarily concerned with proper ceremonial performance rather than promoting ethical behavior or social responsibility among religious participants. Roman religious authorities often used spiritual obligations to justify political policies, economic arrangements, and social hierarchies that benefited the ruling class while imposing costs and restrictions on ordinary people who had no voice in determining religious requirements. Roman religion was essentially political control disguised as spiritual obligation, creating religious systems that served imperial interests rather than providing genuine spiritual guidance for individual believers. The Roman religious marketplace included fraudulent spiritual services, fake miracle cures, and various forms of religious exploitation that targeted desperate people seeking supernatural solutions to problems that required practical interventions. Roman religious commerce created opportunities for spiritual fraud that preyed on human vulnerability, while providing no genuine religious benefits to people who could least afford to waste money on ineffective spiritual services. You're considering joining the Roman legions, and if you expected military service to be a path to glory, adventure, and financial security, you're about to discover that Roman military life was a 25-year commitment to organized violence, brutal discipline, and survival rates that made civilian poverty look like an attractive alternative. Welcome to the Roman army, where volunteering was often preferable to being conscripted. The training was designed to eliminate weakness through systematic trauma, and your chances of surviving to retirement were roughly equivalent to your chances of being struck by lightning while being attacked by wolves. Roman military recruitment targeted young men who were desperate enough to accept 25-year contracts that began with training programs designed to break your civilian identity and rebuild you as a human weapon capable of following orders that might require you to kill friends, family members, or innocent civilians without hesitation. Roman military training was essentially controlled psychological warfare directed at recruits who had volunteered to be transformed into people their former selves wouldn't recognize. The Roman legion training regimen involved daily physical conditioning that included marching 20 miles while carrying 60 pounds of equipment, weapons training with wooden swords that were heavier than actual combat weapons, and construction work that required building fortifications, roads, and siege equipment under battlefield conditions. Roman military education was designed to create soldiers who could perform physical labor that would kill ordinary civilians while maintaining combat readiness for battles that could occur without warning. Roman military discipline included punishments that ranged from public humiliation to execution for infractions that were often arbitrary, subjectively determined, and applied inconsistently depending on the preferences of commanding officers who had absolute authority over the lives and deaths of their subordinates. Roman military justice was essentially legalized tyranny where soldiers surrendered all personal rights in exchange for the privilege of serving an empire that might sacrifice them for trivial strategic objectives. The Roman military diet consisted of hardtack, vinegar, olive oil, and whatever food could be foraged, stolen, or extorted from local populations during military campaigns that could last for years in hostile territories where starvation was a constant threat. Roman soldiers were expected to maintain fighting effectiveness while consuming diets that were nutritionally inadequate and often contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery, food poisoning, and various digestive ailments that killed more soldiers than enemy weapons. Roman military equipment was provided by the state but paid for through deductions from soldiers' wages, creating financial obligations that consumed most military salaries while providing gear that was often defective, poorly maintained, or inappropriate for the climate and terrain where soldiers were required to use it. Roman military economics essentially forced soldiers to purchase the equipment they needed to survive battles that they were required to fight for an empire that treated them as expendable resources. Roman military campaigns involved warfare that was designed to terrorize enemy populations through systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, mass executions of non-combatants, and various forms of collective punishment that soldiers were required to implement regardless of their personal moral convictions about killing defenseless people. Roman military tactics included genocide as standard operational procedure, making military service into participation in war crimes that were considered normal aspects of imperial expansion. The Roman military retirement system theoretically provided land grants and financial benefits for soldiers who survived 25 years of service, but these benefits were often delayed, reduced, or denied entirely depending on political circumstances and administrative convenience. Roman military veterans frequently discovered that their promised retirement benefits were unavailable, inadequate, or located in territories that were still experiencing active warfare, where veteran settlements were vulnerable to attack by enemies seeking revenge against former Roman soldiers. Roman military medical care was more advanced than civilian medicine but still involved treatments that were often more dangerous than the wounds they were intended to heal, creating healthcare systems where battlefield injuries were frequently complicated by infections, amputations, and various medical interventions that reduced soldiers' survival chances. Roman military medicine was designed to return wounded soldiers to combat duty rather than promoting genuine healing or long-term health recovery. The Roman military social structure created hierarchies where advancement depended on political connections, bribes, and favoritism rather than merit, courage, or military competence, leading to command structures where incompetent officers were responsible for tactical decisions that determined whether their subordinates lived or died. Roman military promotion systems rewarded wealth and social status rather than leadership ability, creating armies led by people who were unqualified for positions that required life-and-death decision-making skills. Roman military engineering projects required soldiers to build roads, bridges, fortifications, and siege equipment while maintaining combat readiness and performing regular military duties, creating workloads that were physically exhausting and technically demanding. Roman soldiers were essentially military construction workers who were expected to master multiple skilled trades, while preparing for battles that could require them to use their engineering projects as defensive positions against enemies they had recently been building infrastructure to defeat. The Roman military justice system included decimation, executing every 10th soldier in units that displayed cowardice or disobedience, creating disciplinary procedures where individual soldiers could be executed for the failures of their comrades. Roman military punishment was designed to create collective responsibility that made every soldier accountable for the behavior of people they couldn't control, creating military environments where survival depended on factors beyond individual performance or decision-making. Roman military logistics required soldiers to carry their own food, equipment, and supplies during marches that could cover hundreds of miles through hostile territory where resupply was uncertain and foraging was dangerous. Roman soldiers were essentially self-sufficient military units who had to maintain their own equipment, provide their own food, and treat their own injuries while participating in military campaigns that offered minimal logistical support from higher command levels. Historians still argue whether Roman military service actually provided better opportunities than civilian alternatives or simply offered different types of hardship that were more structured and predictable than the chaos of urban poverty. But evidence suggests that Roman military life was extraordinarily difficult even by ancient standards of physical hardship and personal danger. The Roman military recruitment process often targeted men who were fleeing debts, criminal charges, or family obligations, creating armies composed of people who had chosen military service as an alternative to worse civilian circumstances. Roman legions included significant numbers of soldiers who were essentially refugees from civilian problems rather than patriotic volunteers seeking to serve their empire, creating military units with complex motivations and loyalties that didn't always align with imperial objectives. Roman military culture promoted values that emphasized loyalty to immediate comrades rather than abstract political principles, creating military organizations where soldiers were primarily motivated by personal relationships rather than ideological commitment to Roman imperial goals. Roman military effectiveness depended on social bonds between soldiers rather than political indoctrination, making Roman armies vulnerable to fragmentation when personal loyalties conflicted with official military objectives. You're preparing for a journey across the Roman Empire, and if you expected travel to be an opportunity for adventure, cultural enrichment, and personal growth, you're about to discover that Roman transportation was a gauntlet of bandits, disease, dangerous accommodations, and highway robbery that was both literal and figurative. Welcome to Roman travel, where the famous roads that connected the empire were also convenient hunting grounds for criminals. The inns were more dangerous than sleeping outdoors, and your fellow travelers were just as likely to rob you as the professional bandits who operated with virtual impunity throughout the imperial territory. Roman roads were engineering marvels that were built primarily for military purposes rather than civilian convenience, creating transportation infrastructure that was designed to move armies efficiently rather than providing comfortable travel experiences for ordinary Romans who needed to get from one place to another. Roman highways were straight, durable, and completely indifferent to topographical features that made travel difficult for people who weren't marching in military formations with professional equipment and logistical support. The Roman transportation system relied on walking as the primary mode of travel for most people, creating journey times that were measured in weeks or months for distances that modern people could cover in hours. Roman travel was essentially extended hiking expeditions through territories where civilization was sparse, safety was uncertain, and survival depended on careful planning that could be disrupted by weather, bandits, or simple bad luck that could transform routine journeys into life-threatening ordeals. Roman inns were establishments that combined accommodation with prostitution, gambling, and various forms of criminal activity that made staying at roadside lodgings more dangerous than camping in the wilderness, where at least you only had to worry about wild animals and weather rather than human predators who specialized in robbing travelers. Roman hospitality was essentially organized crime disguised as customer service, creating accommodation systems where guests were more likely to be victimized by their hosts than helped by them. The Roman postal system was reserved for official government communications and wasn't available to civilian travelers, creating transportation networks where ordinary Romans had no reliable methods for communicating with people in distant locations or coordinating travel plans that required advance arrangements. Roman civilian travel was essentially blind navigation through territories where you couldn't obtain current information about conditions, dangers, or opportunities that might affect your journey. Roman travel safety required hiring armed escorts, traveling in groups large enough to deter bandits, and avoiding routes that were known to be particularly dangerous, creating transportation costs that were prohibitively expensive for most Romans while providing no guarantee that expensive security precautions would actually protect travelers from well-organized criminal groups. Roman travel security was essentially protection rackets operated by the same people who created the dangers that travelers needed protection from. The Roman travel accommodation system included lodgings that were infested with insects, contaminated with waste, and operated by people who supplemented their income through theft, extortion, and various forms of fraud directed at travelers who had limited recourse against innkeepers who cheated or robbed their guests. Roman inns were essentially criminal enterprises that provided minimal services while maximizing opportunities to exploit vulnerable travelers. Roman travel food consisted of whatever provisions travelers could carry plus whatever they could purchase from roadside vendors who sold products that were often spoiled, contaminated, or adulterated with substances that weren't originally intended for human consumption. Roman travel dining was essentially continuous food poisoning punctuated by periods of starvation when acceptable food sources weren't available at prices that travelers could afford to pay. The Roman travel season was limited to months when weather conditions didn't make journey impossible, creating transportation systems where travel was concentrated into brief periods when roads were overcrowded with travelers competing for limited accommodation and services. Roman seasonal travel created artificial scarcity that drove up prices while reducing service quality during the periods when travel was actually feasible for most people. Roman sea travel was more efficient than overland transportation but involved weather risks, piracy, and navigation challenges that made maritime journeys dangerous for passengers who had no control over sailing decisions made by ship captains whose priorities were cargo delivery and profit maximization rather than passenger safety or comfort. Roman maritime travel was essentially hitchhiking on cargo vessels where passengers were considered secondary concerns that could be abandoned if circumstances required choosing between cargo and human life. The Roman travel document system required various permits, passes, and official authorizations that were expensive to obtain, easy to forge, and frequently demanded by corrupt officials who extorted bribes from travelers who couldn't afford delays or legal complications. Roman travel bureaucracy was essentially organized extortion that taxed movement while providing minimal actual services to people who needed to travel for legitimate business or personal reasons. Roman travel clothing and equipment required specialized gear that was expensive, heavy, and often inadequate for the range of climate and terrain conditions that travelers encountered during long journeys across diverse geographical regions. Roman travel preparation was essentially military expedition planning for civilian purposes, requiring equipment investments that were prohibitively expensive for most people while providing minimal comfort or convenience during actual travel. Roman travel health risks included exposure to diseases that were endemic to different regions, water contamination that caused digestive ailments, and various environmental hazards that were unavoidable during extended travel through territories where medical care was unavailable or ineffective. Roman travel was essentially voluntary exposure to health risks that could cause permanent disability or death for people who were simply trying to get from one place to another for legitimate purposes. Historians still argue whether Roman travel was actually more dangerous than staying in one location or simply involved different types of risks that were more dramatic and memorable than the everyday dangers of stationary life. But evidence suggests that Roman transportation was extraordinarily hazardous even by ancient standards of personal safety and security. The Roman travel economy created opportunities for various service providers who specialized in exploiting travelers' vulnerabilities, including guides who led people into ambushes, money changers who used counterfeit currency, and merchants who sold defective equipment to people who couldn't evaluate product quality under travel conditions. Roman travel commerce was essentially systematic fraud directed at people who were away from their normal support networks and legal protections. Roman travel information was unreliable, outdated, and often deliberately misleading, creating navigation challenges where travelers made decisions based on false information provided by people who had financial incentives to misdirect them toward expensive services or dangerous situations. Roman travel planning was essentially gambling with incomplete information while making decisions that could determine whether travelers survived their journeys or became casualties of their own transportation choices. You're experiencing Roman nightlife, and if you expected evening entertainment to provide relaxation after a long day of surviving Roman civilization, you're about to discover that Roman nights were periods of genuine terror when ordinary citizens barricaded themselves indoors while the streets were controlled by gangs, criminals, and various predators who treated darkness as their professional work environment. Welcome to Roman after-hours activities, where sunset transformed the already dangerous city into a lawless wasteland where survival required luck, weapons, and the wisdom to stay home until daylight returned to provide minimal safety for people who needed to venture outside. Roman street lighting was essentially non-existent, creating urban environments where darkness was complete except for occasional torches carried by people who were either wealthy enough to hire armed escorts or dangerous enough that other people avoided them. Roman nights were genuinely black experiences where navigation required intimate knowledge of neighborhood geography and the ability to move through familiar territory without visual references that might help you avoid obstacles, criminals, or open sewers. The Roman curfew system was enforced not by official authorities, but by roving gangs who controlled different neighborhoods and charged protection fees to residents who wanted to move through territory that was claimed by criminal organizations. Roman night travel required negotiations with multiple gang leaders who might demand payment, sexual favors, or other forms of tribute from people who simply needed to get from one location to another after sunset. Roman nighttime entertainment venues were establishments that combined gambling, prostitution, drinking, and various forms of criminal activity that attracted people who were looking for excitement and predators who were looking for victims. Roman after-hours entertainment was essentially voluntary participation in criminal activities where customers were as likely to be robbed, assaulted, or killed as they were to have fun, while spending money they couldn't afford on activities that were designed to separate them from their resources. The Roman Night Watch consisted of vigiles who were primarily firefighters with minimal law enforcement training or authority, creating security systems where nighttime crime was essentially uncontrolled, except when criminal activities threatened property values or disrupted business interests of people who were wealthy enough to demand official intervention. Roman nighttime policing was focused on protecting property rather than people, leaving ordinary citizens vulnerable to crimes that were ignored unless they affected economically important assets. Roman nighttime fires were constant threats that could destroy entire neighborhoods within hours because Roman buildings were constructed from flammable materials and firefighting technology was primitive and ineffective. Roman nights included the ever-present possibility of being burned alive in your sleep by fires that could start accidentally or be set deliberately by arsonists who operated with virtual impunity in urban environments where fire detection and suppression were nearly impossible. The Roman nighttime economy included various illegal activities that were more profitable and less regulated than legitimate daytime businesses, creating economic opportunities for people who were willing to accept the risks associated with criminal enterprise. Roman night work included prostitution, gambling, theft, and various forms of black market commerce that provided income for people who couldn't find legitimate employment while contributing to the general lawlessness that made nighttime dangerous for honest citizens. Roman nighttime religious activities included mystery cult ceremonies, unofficial rituals, and various spiritual practices that were performed in secret because they were either illegal or socially unacceptable during daylight hours. Roman night religion was often more authentic and personally meaningful than official daytime worship, but it also involved risks that could result in legal prosecution, social ostracism, or physical violence from people who opposed non-mainstream spiritual practices. The Roman nighttime disposal of waste and dead bodies created sanitation challenges that were managed through unofficial systems that involved throwing garbage and corpses into streets, rivers, or vacant areas where decomposition created health hazards that affected entire neighborhoods. Roman nighttime waste management was essentially organized littering that created disease vectors and contamination sources that made urban environments dangerous for everyone who lived in affected areas. Roman nighttime transportation was virtually impossible for ordinary citizens who couldn't afford armed escorts and torch-bearing servants to provide protection and illumination during journeys through urban areas that were controlled by criminal organizations. Roman night travel was essentially suicide for people who weren't wealthy enough to hire security services or dangerous enough to be left alone by predators who operated in darkness. The Roman nighttime housing security consisted of barricades, locked doors, and various defensive measures that residents used to protect themselves from break-ins, assaults, and other crimes that were routine occurrences in urban areas where law enforcement was minimal and criminals operated with virtual impunity. Roman night home security was essentially siege preparation that residents performed daily to protect themselves from attacks that could occur any time after sunset. Roman nighttime social activities were limited to gatherings in private homes or heavily secured venues that could provide protection from the criminal elements that controlled public spaces after dark. Roman night socializing required careful planning and security arrangements that made evening entertainment expensive and risky for people who simply wanted to spend time with friends or family members without risking their lives or property. The Roman nighttime medical emergency system was essentially non-existent, creating situations where people who became ill or injured after sunset had no access to medical care until daylight returned and physicians resumed their daytime practices. Roman night medical care was limited to whatever first aid family members could provide while waiting for professional medical services that might not be available even during daylight hours. Roman nighttime business operations included various commercial activities that were conducted under cover of darkness to avoid taxation, regulation, or legal scrutiny that legitimate daytime businesses were required to endure. Roman night commerce created parallel economic systems that were more profitable and less regulated than official daytime business, while contributing to the lawlessness that made nighttime dangerous for everyone involved. Historians still argue whether Roman nighttime conditions were actually worse than daytime urban life or simply involved different types of dangers that were more concentrated and dramatic than the everyday hazards that Romans faced during daylight hours. But evidence suggests that Roman nights were extraordinarily dangerous even by ancient standards of urban violence and lawlessness. The Roman nighttime entertainment industry exploited people who were seeking escape from the hardships of daytime life while exposing them to dangers that were often worse than the problems they were trying to forget. Roman night entertainment was essentially predatory capitalism disguised as recreational activity, creating business opportunities that profited from human desperation while providing no genuine benefits to customers who couldn't afford to waste money on expensive distractions from their actual problems. Roman nighttime survival required skills that combined urban warfare tactics with criminal knowledge and street wisdom that honest citizens shouldn't have needed to develop simply to remain alive in their own neighborhoods. Roman night survival was essentially guerrilla warfare training for civilian purposes, requiring ordinary people to become combatants in urban conflicts they hadn't chosen to participate in but couldn't avoid if they wanted to survive in Roman cities. You're approaching the end of your Roman life, and if you expected death to provide dignity, peace, or even basic medical comfort, you're about to discover that Roman mortality was as brutal, expensive, and socially stratified as every other aspect of Roman existence. Welcome to Roman death, where the average life expectancy of 35 years was an optimistic statistic that assumed you survived childhood diseases, workplace accidents, criminal violence, and medical treatments that were often more lethal than the ailments they were supposed to cure. Roman funeral customs required elaborate ceremonies that could bankrupt surviving family members while providing no guarantee that the deceased would receive appropriate honors or proper burial arrangements. Roman death was essentially a final financial catastrophe that forced grieving relatives to choose between honoring their dead loved ones and maintaining their own economic survival, creating funeral systems where expressing grief properly required resources that most Romans couldn't afford to spend. The Roman approach to death included beliefs about afterlife that were confusing, contradictory, and offered little comfort to people who were facing mortality without clear understanding of what happened after death. Roman religious traditions included multiple incompatible theories about post-mortem existence, creating spiritual frameworks where dying people couldn't obtain reliable guidance about how to prepare for whatever experiences might follow their earthly deaths. Roman life expectancy statistics were heavily skewed by infant and childhood mortality rates that were catastrophically high even by ancient standards, creating demographic conditions where surviving to adulthood was a significant achievement that most Romans didn't accomplish. Roman childhood was essentially a gauntlet of diseases, accidents, and various hazards that eliminated large percentages of each generation before they could reproduce or contribute to society as adult citizens. The Roman death industry included professional mourners, funeral directors, and various service providers who specialized in exploiting grieving families through overpriced services that were socially mandatory but financially devastating for people who were already struggling with the economic consequences of losing family members who had been contributing to household income. Roman funeral commerce was essentially legalized extortion directed at people who were emotionally vulnerable and socially obligated to purchase expensive services. Roman burial practices were regulated by laws that restricted where bodies could be interred, how funeral ceremonies could be conducted, and what types of memorial monuments were permitted for different social classes. Roman death was legally stratified so that even in mortality, social hierarchies determined what types of funeral honors people could receive based on their economic status rather than their personal worth or family relationships. The Roman approach to suicide included social attitudes that sometimes celebrated self-inflicted death as honorable while condemning it in other circumstances, depending on factors that were often arbitrary or politically motivated. Roman suicide customs created cultural environments where people facing difficult circumstances might consider killing themselves as socially acceptable alternatives to enduring hardship, poverty, or social disgrace that seemed worse than death. Roman medical care for dying patients was primitive and often counterproductive, involving treatments that increase suffering while providing minimal pain relief or comfort for people who were experiencing terminal illnesses. Roman end-of-life medical intervention was essentially torture disguised as healthcare, making the dying process more painful and prolonged than it would have been without professional medical attention. The Roman understanding of disease causation included theories that attributed illness to supernatural causes, moral failings, or environmental factors that had little connection to the bacterial and viral infections that actually caused most Roman deaths. Roman medical theory created treatment approaches that were often harmful to patients while failing to address the actual causes of the health problems that were killing them. Roman death records were incomplete and unreliable, creating demographic information that probably underestimated mortality rates while failing to document the causes of death that might have provided useful information for preventing similar deaths in the future. Roman record-keeping about mortality was more concerned with legal and property transfer issues than with public health information that might have helped reduce death rates through better understanding of disease patterns. The Roman social support systems for widows, orphans, and other survivors of deceased family members were minimal and often inadequate for maintaining basic survival needs after the death of primary income earners. Roman death created economic crises for surviving family members who lost both emotional support and financial resources when relatives died, often forcing survivors into poverty, slavery, or other desperate circumstances. Roman cremation practices involved burning bodies on funeral pyres that created air pollution and public health hazards, while consuming large quantities of wood that were expensive and environmentally costly. Roman cremation was essentially organized environmental destruction disguised as religious ceremony, creating death rituals that contributed to deforestation and air contamination that affected entire communities. The Roman approach to grief included social expectations that survivors would resume normal activities quickly after experiencing losses, creating cultural pressures that discouraged extended mourning while providing minimal support for people who were dealing with emotional trauma. Roman grief management was essentially emotional suppression disguised as social strength, creating cultural norms that prevented healthy psychological processing of loss and trauma. Roman inheritance laws created legal frameworks where death often resulted in family conflicts, property disputes, and various forms of litigation that could continue for years after the original deaths that had triggered the legal proceedings. Roman death was often followed by legal warfare between surviving relatives who fought over estate distributions that were more valuable than the deceased family members had been while they were alive. Historians still argue whether Roman mortality rates were actually higher than those in other ancient civilizations or if we simply have better documentation of Roman death patterns, but evidence suggests that Roman urban life created health conditions that were extraordinarily dangerous even by ancient standards of disease, violence, and general mortality. The Roman approach to memorial construction included elaborate tombs and monuments that were designed more to display the wealth and social status of surviving family members than to honor the memory of deceased relatives. Roman memorial architecture was essentially competitive consumption that continued after death, creating funeral monuments that served as advertisements for family prestige rather than genuine expressions of grief or remembrance. Roman death ultimately represented the final failure of a civilization that had created impressive technological achievements while maintaining social systems that made life dangerous, uncomfortable, and brief for the majority of people who experienced Roman rule as subjects rather than beneficiaries of imperial power. As the shadows of ancient Rome fade into the gentle darkness of historical memory, you find yourself grateful for the simple luxuries of modern life. Clean water flowing from taps, medical care that heals rather than harms, and the quiet blessing of living in an age where surviving past 35 is not considered a remarkable achievement. The Romans built an empire that lasted centuries, but they built it on foundations of human suffering that we can barely comprehend from our comfortable distance of 2 millennia. Let these ancient voices whisper their warnings softly as you drift towards sleep, reminding you that the progress we take for granted was purchased with the lives of countless people who faced each day knowing that survival itself was victory enough. Close your eyes now and rest easy in the knowledge that you live in times when death comes more gently, and life offers possibilities that Romans could never have imagined in their wildest dreams of a better world.